Recorder, you'll see an article in which Gupta features. And our next speaker also has a letter in the Newham Recorder on the subject of Palestine. So I'd like to introduce to you Rob Ferguson, who is a local Jewish anti-Zionist and teacher and member of the Socialist Workers' Party.
See, I think we've reached a turning point, perhaps even a breaking point in the history of Palestine and the dispossession of its people. Because, on the one hand, nothing can conceal the extent of Israel's war crimes in Gaza. The calibrated, deliberate terror of the Israeli Defense Force has exposed the nature of Israel for all to see. And in response, we've seen the biggest demonstrations in support of Palestine, certainly in my memory. And what is striking, I think, is how mixed the demonstrations are, and also how young. A new generation, many on their first political protests, and I don't believe they are only protesting with Palestine in mind, central though that is. Because I believe there are also protests against war and military intervention, and they are protests against a world marked by racism and injustice from Gaza to Missouri. And even in the United States, portrayed as that rock-solid defender of Israel, a recent poll showed that twice as many young Americans blame the Israelis for the conflict in Gaza than Hamas, with only 25% of them blaming the Palestinians. And this is a poll that sent shockwaves through Israel's political establishment and made the front pages of almost the entire Israeli media. And even long-standing, self-declared liberal Zionist supporters of Israel are beginning to break ranks, and some of them questioning the entire Zionist project. And then on the other hand, we have Israel's propagandists. One in particular I detest, Mark Regev, spokesperson of the Prime Minister of Israel. But every time he and others come on, I believe they provoke ever greater opposition and disgust with each interview, as they intone to their disbelieving audience that the victims of F-16s, drones, tank shells, and high-velocity sniper bullets only have themselves to blame. No humanity, no compassion. And each Israeli victim is humanized while Palestinian children remain mere statistics. I'm reminded of a line from the Jewish figure of Shakespeare's great play, The Merchant of Venice, as he turns on his persecutors and declares, "If you cut us, do we not bleed?" And I want to say something else, because this has nothing to do with Hamas, tunnels or rockets. These attacks long predate Hamas, as Sandra has illustrated. But just to spell some of this out, during the First Intifada, from 1987 to 93, children took on tanks with stones and slingshots. The IDF encouraged troops to break protesters' bones. This was official government policy. Save the Children estimated that during the first 2 years of the Intifada, between 23,000 and 29,000 children required medical treatment for beating injuries. The Association of Israel and Palestinian Physicians estimated that a child under the age of 6 was shot in the head every 2 weeks during the First Intifada. And this is an uprising that began with popular, unarmed street demonstrations. It was the IDF, not Hamas, who militarized the protests. But that same dynamic that we have seen in Gaza in the First and Second Intifadas goes back to the origins of Israel itself, as Sandra has alluded to as well, to what the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has called the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And here I want to touch on something close to my own political development. Because I believe my family suffered in the Holocaust, my relatives of my mother and my father, but the lessons of the Holocaust, I believe, have been debased in Israel's hands, and we cannot allow that to happen. Today's fascist movements across Europe are making Islam and Muslims their target of choice, when Jews and Muslims should be natural allies. Recently, 40 Holocaust survivors and 287 descendants of Holocaust survivors or victims wrote an open letter unequivocally condemning the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. And it was truly shocking to see the vitriol visited upon them in official Israeli media. My mother was a Hungarian Jew. She and my grandfather escaped before the war. My grandmother and my mother's sister did not. My grandmother escaped the trains to Auschwitz. Unlike the 440,000 Hungarian Jews who were deported in 147 trains and 90% of them exterminated on arrival. You see, I like to just repeat the words of a Labour MP, who calls himself a Zionist, as far as I'm aware, Gerald Calvin. But for all my differences with many of his views, on one thing I am absolutely in agreement when he said in the House of Commons, my grandmother did not die in the Holocaust to provide cover for Israeli soldiers murdering Palestinian grandmothers in Gaza. And that, I think, is the real lessons that we have to draw. The most important lesson was this: always stand with the victim, even if you share nothing in common with them, and stand up against those who oppress others, whatever you might share. And to show solidarity with the victims of Gaza, and opposition to the assault, I believe, is a basic act of humanity, whatever your background. But it is more than this. I think Lindsay might well touch more on this, but one of the founding principles of Stop the War was opposition to racism and Islamophobia. I don't believe it's any accident that after the huge protests of Gaza, we have seen the hysteria over ISIS. Not only that, but directed at the Muslim community here. If you listen to our media and politicians, you would start to think that it was our Muslim communities who were the problem. Now, I think ISIS are a horrible organisation, but who is responsible for their rise? Who is to blame? Who should apologise? In my view, it's the ones who went to war, who bombed the Middle East, who bombed Iraq, and then set about enforcing sectarian divisions in order to better cement their own occupation and their own rule. Finish with this, because we've seen fantastic demonstrations. And I think that the momentum behind the protests in Britain and across the world is reminiscent of the anti-apartheid movement after the Sharpeville massacre or the Soweto uprisings. But now we have to build locally. Movements are built in that interaction between national mobilisation and local building of a campaign. And I think Palestine has extremely wide reverberations. It's the litmus test of freedom and democracy across the Middle East. When the workers of Mahala in Egypt struck, Mubarak fell, and the masses who overthrew him occupied the Israeli embassy and tried to break down the border to Palestine. And that is still, I believe, where the potential lies. So solidarity with Palestine, opposition to war, opposition to Islamophobia and racism, and anti-Semitism and fascism are inextricably linked. And therefore, I believe that we face a fight to ensure not only for the Palestinians themselves, although that is foremost, but for a world without war, without racism, without injustice, where Jew and Arab can walk arm in a free Palestine, that means that Palestine must be free from the river to the sea.
That's great, thanks all. We're just going to check if we can do the video link up. I think we're good to go. Excellent, okay, lovely, right. So